Hey everybody, Brandon here with a second tutorial for how to build a route in Train Simulator 2015. In this tutorial I'm going to go over basic track laying, just the basics, nothing too crazy in terms of track laying. Those will be covered in specific tutorials later on. So let's load into the route that I was using for the first tutorial video, if you bothered watching that. And we'll move off to blank space over here. Okay. So this whole tutorial is going to be done in the linear objects tool section. The first thing you want to do is load the appropriate DLC. So in my case I'm using the New York to New Haven DLC and the Northeast Corridor DLC. Based on the type of route that you want to create, you might want to incorporate different DLC. The DLC that you pick determines the type of tracks that are going to show up over here on the left side. So because I have the New York to New Haven DLC and the Northeast Corridor DLC, all the types of track for both of those routes is shown here. Okay? So once you've loaded your appropriate DLC and picked the type of track that you want to lay, click that piece of track. For this scenario, I'm going to be using the NEC track clean. Okay? Now once you've determined the type of track you're going to use, you need to pick the track rule. The track rule is the specific properties that that type of track is going to have. You can use any type of track with any type of track rule, but based on the track rule, your track is going to have different properties. So for instance, this will be a very clear example. When the Northeast Corridor route was released in 2012, I believe, this track rule came with it, the NEC track rule. Now this track rule specifies that when you lay track, default overhead wires will be placed over it. And these look kind of cheesy or whatever, and I didn't want those for my route. So instead of choosing the NEC track rule, I chose the New York to New Haven track rule because I knew that they didn't come with overhead wires by default. You have to add them in later. There's a few other different properties, like the amount of angle on superelevated curves and stuff like that, but the biggest reason for me choosing the New York to New Haven track rule was no default overhead wires. So now I chose the New York to New Haven track rule. I'll lay that same piece of track and you'll see that there's no overhead wires now, because each track rule has different properties. Now you can edit the track rules if you have knowledge of XML, but any modifications you make to a track rule cannot be published on the Steam Workshop. So keep everything default if you're going to be publishing your work on the Steam Workshop for other people to subscribe to. Okay? So now you've chosen your track and your track rule. Let's start laying some track. So I chose my track. The first thing that pops up when you select a piece of track is this yellow arrow. Now if you left click and hold and rotate the mouse, you'll see that the angle at which you can place the track changes. Once you release the left mouse button, you can move the mouse out to lay a long piece of track and curve it around and stuff, and then left click again to place it. That's the basics of laying the track. If you want to lay just straight track, you're going to have to go down here to the bottom left flyout and untick the Snap to Track tool. If you have the Snap to Track tool ticked, you cannot lay perfectly straight track. Now you'll know that you're going to be placing perfectly straight track when the line is yellow. If it's gray, you're laying a curved piece of track. So since I see a yellow piece of track here, I'm going to left click, and now I know that that is perfectly straight. Okay? If you're laying a bunch of track at one time, let's say you're laying a bunch of long sections. By the way, each section of track can be a maximum of 500 meters in length. Let's say you're laying a bunch of straight track. Click, 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 blah, blah, blah. Eventually you get to the point where you have to go all the way down here. By the way, I made the camera move really fast by holding down Shift. while using the arrow keys. Okay, this is without pressing shift. This is while pressing shift. Okay, that's a good little trick to know. But on to what I was saying, if you want to keep up with the track as you lay it, you're going to want to tick this follow network tool. When you have that option selected, the camera will automatically jump to where you finished laying the track, so you can continue laying more track and just click, 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 and you can lay long, long networks like that. Okay? A whole tutorial later on will be dedicated to just the Easements tool, because it really is that difficult to learn how to use. So don't worry about that too much right now. If you watched the introductory video, the video previous to this one, you'll know that the Easements tool, here I'll just show you really quick. The Easements tool is a way to lay track with consistent curvature radiuses. So I'm just going to go through one really quick. This entire curve has the same radius of curvature. Okay. And you use the Easements tool to 1, lay smooth curves, and 2, in order to properly use the super elevation tool. Because if you lay a curve without easements, the super elevation won't work properly. And for those of you who don't know what super elevation is, I'll highlight this curve that I just created with the Easements tool. Tick that, and you see how the track curves out like that. It goes on a cant at an angle. It's called super elevation. In real life, they do this around curves to minimize the centrifugal forces going around the curve, so you can go around the curve at a higher speed without discomfort to the passengers. Okay? That's also the premise for the tilting mechanism on trains like the Acela Express. Tilting into the curve, so there's not as much force going out. So yeah, that's the Easements tool. Remember, I told you a whole tutorial will be dedicated to that later. I went over the Snap to Terrain tool right now. I went over it in the last video. I'll go a little bit more in depth with it right now, though. Let's say I created some terrain or whatever, and I wanted to lay some track following all the way up that. Now, I'm not entirely sure this will work right now. I'm kind of winging it. So let's see if this will work. I turned on the Snap to Terrain tool. Let's see if I can get that at the right angle. Oh yeah, see, it worked. It tries to follow the terrain. It actually it set a consistent angle based on the height of the first piece of terrain, and then went up from there. So that's how the Snap to Terrain tool works. I don't really like it. I don't use it much yet because I haven't dealt too much with gradients and terrain yet in my route. But that's how you do that. The next option down here is number of tracks. So by default, you're going to be laying 1 track. Okay? Now, let's say I had a giant fictional route and I wanted 20 tracks side by side. You just put the number 20 in there. Look at how ridiculous that is. Look at that. Holy crap. And that's how you deal with that. Setting multiple parallel tracks at once. This next one I couldn't get to work in the last video for some reason. I had it working before. This is a predetermined gradient for a piece of track. Let me turn that back to 1. Basically, when you start laying a track, it'll... Oh, now it's working. It'll start going up gradually at the angle that you set. So I set it at... Oh, now it's not working. What the hell? I set it to 10 degrees. It's snapping. Oh, because I had Snap to Terrain on. That's why. I'm a big dummy. There we go. Now it's working. I set the gradient to 10 degrees, so now this piece of track is going up steadily at a 10-degree angle. Alright? Most normal purposes, you're going to keep that at 0. Now this bottom one is best explained if I create a crossover. Alright. Now this bottom option is manual junctions. So let's say I just create a sample crossover. This would be a good little demonstration for the snap to track tool. Okay. You'll see that this little object right here is automatically created when you create a crossover. This little object, you'll learn what they look like, but that one is an automatic junction, meaning it's remotely controlled by dispatch. Now you can choose to create a manual junction. A lot of freight yards have manual junctions where a person actually has to go out there and hand crank this thing in order to get the crossover to go. So if you tick manual junctions down here at the bottom, and then you go to create your crossover, you can already see what's going on. It creates a hand crank one, okay? That's a manual junction. Most cases for modern routes you're going to have that disabled, unless you're working in a freight yard or the type of route that you're working on calls for it. What else to laying track? Trying to think of some common examples. Oh, I know exactly what to do. So let's get, actually yeah, let's get a nice piece of curved track going. Blah blah blah. And then let's say for some reason I started building down here and wanted to get these pieces connected. How do I do it? Well, in order to connect two pieces of track together that are coming from opposite ends, you need to use the snap to track tool. So have that enabled, and then start going to lay your track. So I'll show you. And what you're looking for is a pink line to pop up. Yeah, there you go. You can see that it just popped up. It'll snap to that point and connect the pieces of track. You see that pink line that's popping up there. So I left click, and then you'll see that the residual part that wasn't connected is still left over. You're going to want to select that small piece of track that isn't part of the network anymore, click it, delete it, and then you're left with this point that you can use the weld tool on. Weld, weld. Okay. And now that's one contiguous piece of track. Alright, so that's how you connect two pieces together. If you saw the introductory video I made before, you'll see that it kind of went awry. I didn't do it quite right. Here's another good example that I could use for this snap to track tool. Connecting this part to that part. See how simple that is? It actually created a nice crossover too. Alright, so that's snap to track. Remember, if it's on, it's going to be expecting you to snap it to a piece of track, so you can't lay straight track. If it's off, it's not expecting you to connect it to another piece of track, so you can lay straight track. Okay. What else can I talk about with regarding track laying basics? Oh, track properties. So when it comes time to set speed limits for your track, how do you do it? Okay, you're going to be using the select tool. If you watched the introductory video, you're going to know that it's the square with the hashed lines on it. So click the select tool, and then let's say that you want this area before the crossover to be 60 miles an hour. So you highlight that part up to there, and then you'll see this flyout pop up on the right side. There's a bunch of properties you can change from here, such as the type of track that it is, the primary speed limit, which is the speed limit for passenger trains. So let's say 60. And then The secondary speed limit is the speed limit that'll be enforced for freight trains. So let's say we want freight trains to only go 30 here. Okay? There's other things that you can specify, whether it's a mainline track, a yard, a passenger line, or a freight line. We're just going to keep mainline for now. I'll go into more detail about the effects that this value has later. What direction trains can go on it, whether it's bi-directional, trains can go this way or that way, or whether they're restricted to going in one direction. You could also specify whether it has no overhead wires. That'll be for strictly diesel travel. Overhead wires, which would be for electric trains. Third and fourth rail, which is another thing that could be used for electric trains. The type of sound that is played when trains go over this type of track. Just leave it as default usually. And I've never found a need to modify this special collision setting, so keep that as is. If you're laying curves with the Easements tool, and you want the curve to be super elevated, you tick this box, the super elevation box. And then finally you have this setting called unevenness. You'll notice when you're driving a train in Train Sim 2015 that the train will randomly bob and bounce left to right and up and down or whatever. This is trying to simulate uneven parts in the track. The higher the number that you put here, the more bumpy and uneven the track will be. 0 is perfectly flat. 10 is a nice value for modern high-speed rail. They really screwed up in the Northeast Corridor route. They put it at a value of 50. It's so bumpy. It's unbearable. 10 is a nice value. If you have really nice modern high-speed track, you can set it to 5. Okay. What was I going to discuss next? We just did all the properties. Oh yes, I was going to talk about the difference between all these: mainline, yard, passenger, and freight. So you're laying track, and you have nice straight track for a little while, but then you have to go into a really tight curve. So you're laying the curve, and you notice that, hey, I want this curve to go tighter. Why won't it go tighter? You can modify this track type setting. These change the minimum radius of curvature that you can create. So it goes in this order: mainline, most shallow curves, then passenger, next most shallow curves, then freight, next most shallow curves. You're seeing how the curves are getting sharper as I go down, and then yard has the most sharp curves. See that? So let's say you needed a really sharp curve like that. This would be something like a 10-mile-an-hour curve. You'd select yard. Or if you needed... Actually, this will be a good little example. That bottom part is yard. This one's freight. This one's passenger. These are the minimum, like the sharpest curves you can get. Yeah, I'm just trying to line that up properly. 1 second, it's being a little fickly. Alright, and there's mainline. So from bottom to top, yard, freight, passenger, mainline. It's the sharpest curves you can make, okay? I hope that makes sense. So if you want to make sharper curves, change it to a lower setting, okay? That's pretty much it with regards to basic track laying. The really advanced stuff comes when I talk about the Easements tool and how to create properly super elevated curves. That's probably the hardest track laying concept to grasp. And when the time comes, I'm going to put a lot of time into making sure that you guys properly understand it. It was really difficult to learn how to do it myself. Yeah, so that's basic track laying and how to deal with joining pieces of track together, crossovers, multiple tracks side by side, curved versus straight track, the follow network tool. Yeah. I don't know what I'm going to do for my next tutorial yet, but stay tuned. Thanks for watching.